It should come as no surprise then that Napoleon promptly commissioned his minister to, quote, establish in such of his domains as are best suited for the cultivation of beet a manufactory similar to that of Monsieur de Lesseps. Napoleon, in fact, proposed to become de Lesseps' commercial competitor. In this tale of two sugars, and I make no apologies for having strayed rather from the topic of public health, it seems to me that the questions we might ask about past potent substances still remain for the most part not only unanswered, but also perhaps even unasked by historians. Who was responsible for prescribing which foods and drugs should be sanctioned for consumption in any given culture? How did the concerns, agendas and actions of different groups involved in negotiating such sanctions relate to one another? And how are important transformations in consumption, such as, in this case, the shift from cane sugar to beet, accomplished? What was the relationship between medical knowledge, which could be appropriated by anyone, and medical expertise, which could only be wielded by a few? These questions, of course, seem of much more pressing concern when set in the context of the value of capturing historical truth for organisations which are today deeply invested in this relationship between food policy, consumption, commerce, and the ethics of scientific or technical innovation versus tradition. So I suppose my closing argument or plea is that we should try to understand what's at stake in that sense, in retelling the history of food and drugs, that we should try to understand it in part as a story of expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I'll open up for questions and comments. Yes.
It's a slightly tangential question, but given that most of the sugar cane was imported presumably from the Caribbean, where was the whole population getting its sugar from before there was substantial importation from that direction?
Well, in fact, the history of colonial cultivation and the history of consumption are exactly in parallel, as people like Sidney Mintz have shown. So, in effect, you know, the sugar was consumed in absolutely minute quantities in the Middle Ages, so that it really only takes off in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as the colonies start to be developed. And in fact, it wasn't imported as cane. It was processed and even refined in the colonies and then imported as refined sugar. I think it was Mike. Oh.
What's the chemical composition of grape sugar as compared to normal whatever sugar cane or whatever have you? It must be a higher content of fructose.
Grape sugar is, I think it's an isomer, it's a single sugar, and it's glucose, whereas cane sugar is sucrose, so it's a compound of two sugars. But they did, I mean, this is not something that they could in any way demonstrate chemically at the time.
No, I'm wondering whether there are any taste differences, because fructose has a slightly different taste. So, and my question is, would that correlate with any taste preferences?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it?
I mean, sweet. The fructose is less sweet.
It wasn't fructose. It was actually generally seen to be sweeter. But one of the things that's interesting in this case is that there was a lot of debate over whether beet sugar was as sweet as cane sugar, so that the commission ultimately ended by running a taste test, does a double-blind taste test. And they made the point, and I'm sorry I haven't got the quote here because it's a wonderful quote, but they said something like that essentially, depending on whether people believed something to be cane sugar or not, they deemed it to be sweet. So in other words, if they thought something was cane sugar and they were given a sample of it, they would judge it to be sweeter than another sample which they thought was a sugar surrogate. So the actual evaluation, this is what they're interested in. They're not interested in kind of overall sweetness. They're interested in relative sweetness, political sweetness, as it were, what consumers would take on board in terms of what was acceptable. And what's interesting is that chemists started out with this notion that somehow sweetness ought to be the ideal. And they very rapidly found out that it wasn't sweetness at all. Because if that had been the case, then grape syrup was sweeter than cane sugar or than beet sugar. But even when they got around to producing crystalline beet sugar, what it then boiled down to is the fact that taste was completely manipulable. and it was manipulable by means of doing things like dressing it up as cane sugar and presenting it in the market as pure cane sugar. And I think that tells us actually quite a lot about the relationship between knowledge experts, governments and consumers as it starts to develop in this early industrial period. It's not about taste per se, it's about all the things we worry about with industrial foods, like the manipulation.
Something with purity.
Yeah, yes.
I guess we cannot find out today
Yes.
how pure was the beet sugar.
Well, this is actually an interesting point because in the late 1770s and early 1780s, new refining processes had been developed in a kind of collaboration between Parisian chemists and sugar refiners on I can't think of the word now. On the Caribbean islands, the French Antilles. And so this technology was rapidly shifted back and forth between the different Caribbean islands and became general, so that almost all the refined sugar reaching France by the mid-1780s was very highly refined. It was a much more efficient process and much more effective in terms of removing contaminants. It produced a very pure, very white sugar. And essentially what you could suggest here is that the consumers who rioted in the 1790s were people who had had a decade of getting used to a much purer, whiter sugar than before. And so they saw it as being, a sort of return to the bad old days before the 1780s. So that, yes, there's a historical trajectory to this as well. We do know that there's an improvement. We can't say what absolutely, the levels of purity were, but we can say what the relative levels of purity were perceived to be.